Welcome to Cove Presbyterian Church. Today, for the prelude for the worship service, I'm going to play one movement of a sonata by Franz Schubert. It's the sonata in B-flat major, movement 2, which is marked Andante sostenuto. This piece, the second movement of a sonata whose other movements are very different in mood and even in key. It's crazy that this sonata is in the key of B-flat major. And then he wrote this second movement, this beautiful second movement in C-sharp minor, which is like, if you know anything about keys, it's far away. Anyway, it's very different from the other movements of this sonata, which are all wonderful but different. One fascinating aspect of it for me is the relentless, repeated rhythm in the left hand, which also crosses over the right hand in the first part, and then a different rhythm when that same material returns towards the end, before the end, after a more cheerful middle section, which is in a major key. You'll hear it. You'll hear what I'm talking about when you listen. So, Schubert, second movement of the great B-flat sonata.
Good morning. I bring you greetings this morning from Union Presbyterian Seminary. We have campuses in Richmond, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. And it is a delight for me to be here sharing with you virtually today with worship with one of my closest and dearest friends. Let us now prepare our hearts to listen for God's word to us. There's always someone. Everybody else follows the rules. Everybody else does what is expected. Everybody else recognizes that there are codes of conduct, and if we are to keep our community strong, we must abide by them. It's not just about us and what we want, after all. It is about all of us, making sure that all of us feel comfortable and secure and content. So sometimes, even if you don't like doing it, don't want to do it, you must take your Christmas decorations down in an appropriate time frame. What's appropriate? I think you ought to drag that dead Christmas tree out to the curb on New Year's Day. If you happen to be married to a sentimental spouse, maybe you leave it up until the weekend after New Year's Day. If you know what you're doing, maybe you can even get away with leaving the stuff up until Epiphany. But that's only if you know what Epiphany is. If you can't define Epiphany, you can't have your Christmas stuff up past New Year's Day. That's the law. Well, at least it ought to be. So you can only imagine how annoyed I am now that we're dealing with this social distancing thing and working from home, and I can't get out except for some long walks with my wife and daughter and dog around our neighborhood. We're yelling at people because we're talking to them from 10 feet away. I always add 3 feet to whatever the government tells me to do. We're crossing over to the other side of the street when we meet someone coming our way. I feel like that cartoon character, Yosemite Sam, adversary of Bugs Bunny, with his 6-shooters up in the air hollering out, "Back off!" But all that's beside the point. I'm annoyed because I have to walk this neighborhood walk at least 3 times a day to get some outdoor time. And until a few days ago, one of my neighbors still had Christmas stuff up in the front yard. It was the beginning of April. It's spring. But there they were, these gargantuan, gigantic reindeer all lit up. Very tasteful display, I must say, or it would have been had it been in season, but it was completely out of season. Who has lit up reindeer frolicking around on their front lawn in the middle of spring? If it weren't for this social distancing thing, I might have wanted to go over there and have a chat with those people. Why? Why does someone having Christmas decorations up in spring bother me, of all people? I grew up in a small-town Baptist church. I didn't have a clue about all this Christian season stuff. Sure, I knew Christmas and Palm Sunday and Easter, but that was about all we celebrated. I don't remember learning anything in church about Lent or Epiphany. Now, all of a sudden, I seem to want to be the commissioner of the church calendar. I think it happened when I became Presbyterian. Yes, if my grandfather was alive, great Baptist deacon that he would certainly agree. The Presbyterians did this to me. Taught me about the Christian calendar, the Christian year, and the way Christian people celebrate it. Freely, not obsessively, generously, not legally. And that's really what I felt when I looked at those reindeer 3 times a day this spring. I smiled when I saw them. I remembered the gift of the Christ child when I saw them. And that memory does me a world of good in these difficult days. Because the message of that Christ child come to this grown-up world was the message that we are not alone. God is with us. God comes to be with us in our anxiety, in our pain, in our trauma, in our panic, in our illness, in our uncertainty, in our fear. These people in Palestine in the first century were living in fear of many kinds. Herod was a narcissistic ruler who thought more about his own image and power than he thought about his people. This people was right to fear him. Rome was an empire that thought more about exploiting the resources of the world for its own self-absorbed benefit than it thought about the global common good. The people of this time was right to fear it. The economic environment was one where the lowly and poor were becoming more destitute by the day, while the powerful and the wealthy increased their profits and widened their margins of economic and social distance from those from whom their policies impoverished. This people was right to fear it. And God? God, in the midst of it all, has suddenly, seemingly gone quiet. The voices of the prophets rung out no more. The challenging, correcting cry, "Thus says the Lord," was heard no more. Where was God in the midst of this people's struggle? Almost a century later, in this God story, the would-be prophet John, exiled on the island of Patmos, knows that his people are asking precisely that same question. Where exactly is God? I suspect that the book of Revelation, with all its plagues and pandemics, is exactly the book of the Bible that many people least want to hear from right about now. And yet, it stands out like a lit-up reindeer in the middle of spring, a reminder that the Christmas story remains the pertinent story as long as a century or even 2 millennia after the Christ child was in that manger born. The book of Revelation story and the Christmas story are in one very small but very important way the same story. In their essence, they are both stories about fear. The fear of being left alone in the middle of devastation. The ensuing reassurance that even now, in the midst of this mess, God is with us. Emmanuel in the Gospel of Luke. One with eyes like a flame of fire and feet like burnished bronze, with a voice like the sound of many waters in the apocalypse. In the apocalypse and in the story of Jesus' birth, the fear gets worse before it gets better. There are these shepherds, not kings, not rulers, not wise men, not wealthy men, not powerful people, shepherds, down low on the social food chain, without representation in the political hierarchy, lacking luster in the economic stratosphere. Suddenly, these impoverished people working in the darkness are lit up by a bright light. No doubt expecting the torchlight of a hostile police or military force come to hunt and harm them, they go still with fright. And to their already horror-filled world, they believe comes what appears to be a fright even more formidable. They are terrified. They know that there is nothing they can do but take what is coming. And as they brace for what is coming, there comes a word. Do not be afraid. For this day, I bring you good news of a great joy. You are not alone. God has come to be with you. God will join with you in your circumstance so that God can teach you how to change your circumstance. God starts it with Jesus. The baby becomes a man. The man inaugurates a mission. The mission mandates the incoming reign of God. The reign, through the way this man lives his life, offers us a glimpse of what life can be like if we choose to live our lives as he lived his life. We can change this world when and if we change ourselves into his image. When we live into his expectations for us, what he demands from us. Fearful of the man and the change he represents and the demands he makes, we reject him. We reject God with us. We tear God out of our lives and return our lives to the physical, social, and spiritual distance from God that we enjoyed from that moment in the field, before that moment in the field with those shepherds and that bright light and that comforting word. Having been drawn into God's embrace, afraid of what that embrace demands that we become, commits us to do, we cross God's Son out of our lives and so determine to distance ourselves from God forever. But God won't let go. Instead of using the death of the Son as the ultimate divide between God and humans, God uses that death as an eternal link that will bind us to God forever. Almost a century after that shepherd scene outside that tiny town, seeing God's move this time on a grand cosmological scale from a dark cave in Patmos, John also sees the light. Jesus died, and yet Jesus lives. The firstborn of those who rise in God's unrelenting love for us. Jesus lives. As messianic witness to God's desire never to leave us alone, Jesus lives. As risen Christ with us, even now, in the midst of this pandemic, risen to be Christ, to be with us. What does it mean? John can't explain it any more than could those stupefied shepherds keeping watch over their flocks by night. John locks up with a fright that freezes him just as formidably. Like the shepherds, he hears a voice, booming as though it was the thunder of the apocalypse come to signal the end of all things. Of course, he is afraid. His world had already been torn apart. The imperial weight of Rome lay upon the freedom of his people, holding it down, snuffing out any hope that they would ever rise into freedom again. Rome demanded his people's loyalty. Rome demanded his people's patriotism. Rome demanded his people's worship. Rome demanded his people's financial freedom. Rome demanded his people draft into its military operations. Rome demanded his people's very identity. Where was God in this? The answer came as it came to the shepherds. A voice from the heavens. This one, like the call of a trumpet blasting out into the darkness of an early morning, demanding that everyone who heard it rise to reckon with the opportunities and the challenges of the coming day. And the voice said exactly the same thing the angelic voice said to the shepherds. Do not be afraid. Why? Because though dead, I now live. To what purpose? The same purpose for which I came on that night as Emmanuel, to be God with you. You open the distance, I have closed it. I have come back to close it further still. He shows it more than he speaks it. John sees something like a human one who is us but is more than we could ever be, the human one, the one who represents who we would be if we were all that God expects we can be. This human one is walking in the midst of 7 lampstands. 7 is a symbol for wholeness. The lampstand is a symbol for the church. So this is what John sees, the human one walking in the midst of the 7 lampstands, the 7 churches, the whole church. In other words, God's people are still not alone. No matter the darkness, no matter the danger, the human one walks with us in the midst of us. Emmanuel still, Emmanuel forever. We couldn't emulate him the first time. We refused to emulate him the first time. Crucified him out of our frame of reference so he would just leave us alone. He came back so we would have another chance to be for each other what he has been for us, the assurance that there is something, someone watching over us, watching with us, caught up with us in all the struggles and the fears that we face. When we watch over and watch with others with our love and with our resources, we model on this earth what He is even now scripting in the heavens. Our acts of justice, remember His ministry of justice from the past and anticipate His reckoning of justice in the future. Our acts of love, remember His ministry of love from the past and anticipate His unveiling of eternal love in the future. Our sacrificing of ourselves to change the circumstances that choke the life out of people and communities around us, remember His sacrifice of His very life from the past and anticipate His gift of our new life in the future. As He walks with His churches, giving them hope and assurance that they are not alone, even in the most dire of circumstances, so we must walk amidst not only His churches, but His people, all our people, not just the ones like us, but especially the ones not like us, not as rich, not as powerful, not as educated, not as privileged, not as spiritually safe and physically secure. So we walk into their lives using our bodies and our resources and our intellects to change their lives. That is how we move from God with us to God's people with everybody, with anybody who needs us. If God can move through a crying baby in Palestine, God can move through a whining Christian in church. If God can move like the human one in a vision of the end time meant to give hope in the present time, then God can move us to be more human than we ever thought we could be. And it starts with just being there, as God was there, with the shepherds, with the 7 churches, with us. Don't ever underestimate the power of being there, being us, with us. Presence lifts the spirit. An elevated spirit can reanimate the Christian body to stir the world with its voice, change the world with its actions. Happened when God was with those shepherds. Happened when the human one was with those churches. Can happen, will happen when we are with God's people, encouraging them, resourcing them, empowering them, because they know that they don't do what they do. They don't live as they live alone. Things like this pandemic, it's not about us. It's about God with us. It's about us with God's people. It's about not being afraid because we are not alone. The human one walks in the midst of us, encouraging us to be more human now than we have ever been, even at a distance, to be present with others as God is present with us. So we know, even when we are bound up in our home, staying 6 feet apart in our world, we are not alone. So, one of my last acts on my seminary campus, before we closed my campus to maximize the possibility of physical distancing, was this thing I did alone. I preached a sermon alone. I had been invited some time ago to preach on Palm Sunday at one of the churches that partners with Union Presbyterian Seminary in mission and ministry. Their people and their funding have been instrumental in building a resource base to help us envision, inaugurate, and nurture one of our vital educational ministries. But the advent of the coronavirus and the COVID-19 disease it spawns changed the plans. Churches were no longer to meet in sanctuaries, as you are not meeting this morning in the sanctuary. Worship would have to be streamed as your worship is being streamed this morning. And since the church is not in Richmond, I was unable to travel to be with them in a mostly empty sanctuary to preach the sermon. So they asked if I could tape the sermon and send it to them. I thought of our preaching lab. I contacted my preaching professor and asked him if the lab would be free, and since we had by then already gone fully to online classes, he said I had the run of the place. I could tape the sermon whenever I wished. I wished to do it before we formally closed the campus. Because, it's one thing preaching in an empty preaching lab. It's a whole other thing preaching in a gargantuan, Gothic, 4-story, 123-year-old echoing hall. That just feels empty. That just feels alone. But I donned my robe and my Union Presbyterian seminary stole, and I wandered like some crazy John the Baptist in the wilderness through an empty Watts Hall, and I climbed 3 stories up to the preaching lab. Thank goodness I had learned how to do all of the recording by myself. Still, once I had the equipment running and was looking into the camera, behind the lectern, the microphone properly positioned, I had this feeling of overwhelming oddness. It was the first time in a long time that I actually had preached a sermon with nobody in the room, or even preached a sermon in practice out loud. I remembered when I used to do that all the time to get ready for worship on Sunday morning, but no more. I stopped doing that a long time ago. But this is our collective moment now, right? Preaching in an empty room, yet knowing and trusting and hoping that the message will reverberate. I looked into the emptiness of the camera lens in front of me. And I started speaking. And it felt so odd. I mean, I preached in some dead congregations before, but this was ridiculous. There was just emptiness out there. Emptiness in the room, grave anxiety outside the room. I was just alone, and I didn't like it. But I kept going because I am dutiful, and the dutiful thing was to record this sermon to nobody at the moment so it could be preached back in front of lots of bodies on Palm Sunday. And then while I was going through these motions, there was this moment when I was preaching, just me, just that empty room, that a sensation of true oddness overwhelmed me. Like a light in the darkness, like a voice calling my name. There was this thing, this feeling. I felt the church in that empty room with me. I hear people talk about it all the time, reference it all the time, but I had never experienced it. For the first real time, I actually felt the cloud of witnesses, felt the heat of them, felt the moisture of them, the pressing in of them, the walking around of them. I hear people say it all the time. I never feel it, but this time I felt it. I felt them, and I didn't feel alone. I felt like they were listening to me, encouraging me, the way like when I have preached in Black Baptist congregations and they have talked back to me all through the sermon. The cloud felt like it was talking back. It was, just for a fleeting moment, exhilarating. A shepherd in the fields keeping watch over their flock-like moment. The human one walking in the midst of the lampstands-like moment. In that preaching lab by myself, keeping my distance, and yet I don't believe I was alone. Just like I realized standing here in this preaching lab all over again by myself, saying these words, I'm not alone. I look at the camera lens and I feel this cloud of witnesses. Long before the technology gurus started storing digital data up there, we Christians own the cloud. You don't have to be a resurrected saint to be a part of the cloud of witnesses. You can be physically distant and virtually or prayerfully or spiritually present. We can find other ways to be present. Humans are social beings. In this time of physical distance, we must be more human now than we have ever been. We must be like the human one who, even though his last physical embrace took place more than 2,000 years ago, is with us even now. Because of him, because of all of you right now, I know I'm not alone. So what do I do with that not aloneness? That's the question. I think the answer is, I try to replicate it. The way God replicated it by appearing from a distance to those shepherds. The way the human one replicated it by closing the distance with those lampstands. The way I figure God's Holy Spirit replicated it for me in that preaching lab. Here is our moment, not only to remember that in all this anxiety and fear and distancing that we are not alone, that God is with us, but also to replicate for others this presence of God with us, even in the absences we must continue for weeks or months more to bear. If you truly believe that God is with you, if you truly believe that you are therefore not alone, figure out a way, even across a distance, to replicate that not aloneness with somebody who needs to know that God is truly, even now, especially now, with us. The God who died with us on the cross surely lives with us as we cross through this perplexing, troubling time. That is the good news. We spread that good news by replicating that presence. On that night in Bethlehem, it was angels talking. In that cave on Patmos, it was the human one walking. In these days in Virginia and New York and the United States and planet Earth, there must be ways we can talk and walk the presence of God still. Just because we must stand at a distance does not mean that we must be distant. Cards and calls, letters and emails, packages and lunches, blogs and communal prayers, FaceTime and Zoom time, family time and neighborhood walk time, sermons and op-eds, sewing surgical masks, grocery shopping for the elderly, creating online donation portals for people who have lost their jobs. In this age of technology and science, there must be so many ways that we can replicate the human one by being the most caring beings, the most caring human we can be, even from a distance. If we focus on that with as much energy as we focus on our fear, I suspect we will feel the cloud of witnesses hovering all about us, supporting us, precisely because we are focused on supporting others. Do not be afraid. Be Emmanuel. Be human. Be present. Even now. Especially now. Amen.